Zeckman as our featured guest for today. Will's our aftermarket engineer and shop supervisor, relatively new to Sumitomo, but been with us for about 7 months, but not new to the industry at all. Will has his master's in mechanical engineering and has worked both in manufacturing and design engineering in previous roles. So we'll go ahead and get started. Will, the first question we get a lot of questions about is temperature. So gearboxes, we know they get warm. We know just from the nature of them, they do get warm. So what can you tell us about temperature?
Adam, that's a good question. Well, the first thing you want to know is that temperature is dependent on your conditions and not necessarily every gearbox should be the same. They're going to alter a little bit. And one of the most important things to know is what your ambient temperature is and where to look. So most books and operating manuals, they'll say, look in the sump, but that's pretty difficult. Getting into the gearbox and getting that temperature is not easy if you don't want to take your gearbox out of operation. So we recommend a few points and analyzing them with a FLIR monitor or just a temperature gun and gathering information that way.
Right.
So we typically say the AGMA standard, 40C or 100F above ambient temperature is probably the area you want to stay within.
Okay. Now, in some cases, you can't get an accurate temperature, as you said, the oil sump. What are some ways to check or where to check on, say, some of these gearboxes here? We'll start with the smaller ones. We'll show the larger gearbox here in a second, but where would be the best places to check in general on a gearbox?
Sure. So just so we're all on the same page here, this is going to be your input side, output. The higher speed is going to be moving and revolving significantly faster for obvious reasons.
Right.
So that is going to generate a lot more heat. You're going to want to look right around here for that high-speed bearing. That's going to be your hot point as well as the high-speed seals.
Okay.
So that is where you would check on a smaller unit like this one. If you have a unit like this, quill input, it's going to be right around here again, that high-speed bearing. And that's where we would recommend you look.
Right. So that's our Cyclo product. That's a little unique in that all the reduction is done here. But in general, high speed, low speed, regardless of the design of the gearbox, high speed is always going to be warmer.
Correct.
Now, if you do look on the low speed, where would you check there? Knowing that it is theoretically runs cooler because it's the temperature, the work isn't being done there. The high speed, it's spinning faster. But where would you check on the low speed?
Good question. Again, check right around the seal. You're going to want to check around the bearings and areas that are easily exposed so that you can get a truer reading of those rotating elements.
Okay. Now, some of them have fans. What do we consider with a fanned unit? Like a shaft mounted fan or even an external mounted fan? What would we want to worry about there?
So the fan will try to cool down the gearbox. That's why it's there.
Right.
So if you can't get to your high speed end, you're obviously not going to be able to get as accurate of a reading as you would like. So I would say do not try to measure, the fan temperature. Maybe look on the other side and get that bearing speed temperature there.
Okay. And consider anything blocking airflow. So if there's some applications very dusty, very dirty, you want to make sure you clean that out too.
Exactly. And you're going to want to, if you have debris or processed material on the exterior of your unit, wiping that off is going to help a lot. That'll kind of block the temperature and you'll just get a better reading if you clean it up.
Okay. And how about let's walk over to this one here. We can show the larger gearbox and we can show some examples of dirt and coverage like that. So we'll walk over here.
Sure.
So showing on that side there.
So the area we're looking at here is input here. Here's a seal. The bearings are right inside, and we know your gearbox probably will not look like this. It'll probably have a cover. Hopefully it will. So you're going to want to look at points right in here that are rotating the fastest. You can use something just like this, a temperature gun, and point it right in there with the red laser at the seals, and you'll be able to get your reading right on the back here.
And now you see that that's a cleaner side there. So you always, like we're talking about debris, you want to make sure you're getting a clean surface.
That's correct. If you look on this side, there is a bit more debris, and it's going to be more difficult to get a true reading of the temperature in there. You can see just on this cover alone, the difference that it makes.
Right, the blue paint is the color of the unit, so we want to make sure that's where we're getting our reading from.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
Another option you have for monitoring is going to be a FLIR monitor. This one will also show you a range of temperatures and what the points look like. As you can see, there is a whole multicolored screen, shows your temperature range and what you're looking at. You can capture these images as well. And it makes it easier when you're looking at the exterior and wanting to see where are the hot spots.
and for reporting purposes, you can take that picture, add it to report, and get that trend data. So the key with
Correct.
this also is to make sure you're not just looking at one data point.
That's
So
correct.
expand on that a little bit.
So you're going to want to be checking this information more than once. First at startup, then as you go through the operation and seeing how is the temperature changing, is it consistent? And an important part of that is checking temperature at the same locations. You don't want to take one reading here in August and then here in September, and you're going to want to be consistent with that. Consistency is key, and consistency in your intervals of when you're checking these temperatures.
And from a reporting standpoint, that could really mess up your trending because you're trending it on this, then all of a sudden you're trending over there. Somebody who's reading that report won't understand
Correct.
what happened. Why is it so much cooler all of a sudden?
Correct.
So making sure you're at the same thing. From what I've seen, a lot of guys will take a paint pen or something similar and mark it. I measured temperature here on this date, or obviously logging it in some type of
Yes.
CMS system or something like that. But
And that
consistency.
makes, like you said, those little tricks of using a paint marker and then hitting at the same point makes it a lot easier and kind of error proofs the whole checking process.
Right. And it's over time. The trend is important.
Correct. If you see a big spike that's heating up really quickly upon a startup,
Short amount of time.
that is when you might need to look at what's going on there. If it gradually increases, that's typically normal.
Okay. And that's going back to ambient a little bit too. We use that 100-degree Fahrenheit over ambient. You have to consider where it's mounted too. So if you're next to a kiln,
Yes.
there's going to be heat coming from that. So if it's on this side, for example, this side will obviously be hotter.
Yes.
So considering things like that.
And it might be 180 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, and that's still okay. And it sounds very hot, but that it'll still run properly.
Right. So the hand trick isn't the best trick in most cases.
Correct. You can touch it, and the low speed end should be fine, unless, like you said, you're next to a kiln or heater, something like that, where it's very warm.
Right.
But just because it feels hot doesn't mean it's too hot.
And my hand is going to be different than your hand. And obviously for safety reasons, you don't really just want to touch a gearbox
Correct.
when you don't know how hot it is.
Correct.
So temperature. Okay. So the next question we get a lot about is noise. So what
Yes.
can you say about noise?
So first to start, noise is very subjective. It's one of the most difficult questions we get because of a lot of different factors occur during this, looking at noise and what's on the gearbox and what is loud to one person is different to another person. So the first thing we look at is kind of the adders that are on the gearbox. I'll show you some over here. On this BBB here, we have a sheet metal cover. This is going to amplify the noise. As you can hear, it will make noise itself as well as amplify what's coming out the output. The next thing would be other elements. This is hollow and it's the oil fill cup, and that will make some noise as well. The other thing to look at is what type of noise you're hearing. If you're hearing something that is really rapid and high pitched, it's likely coming from the high speed. If it's lower and it's kind of a longer interval between when you hear it, it's going to be coming from the low speed. And you think about it, when we're looking at this gearbox again, this has to turn, X amount of times for this to turn once. that time interval is how often you would hear a noise, likely if there's something kind of clunking around and on this low speed end.
So a lot of that can depend on ratio as well.
That's correct. That ratio will determine how long that interval is between noises if it's on the low speed end, and it will be a lower pitched kind of clunking noise.
Right. Okay. Now, what other factors with noise external to the gearbox? So you mentioned covers, but what about frames and I mean, loose bolts is a common one that we get sometimes too.
Loose bolts is a common one.
Like mounting bolts, not necessarily
Yeah.
gearbox, but
So mounting bolts can be one. You got to make sure you're properly mounted. That's pretty important as well. Making sure everything's tightened, your breathers and all the housing bolts. That's true. Your couplings can get loose, and that's something to check as well.
common PM type things. You want to preventative
Yes.
maintenance, always check those sort of things.
Correct. Make sure everything's torqued properly.
Right. And one phenomenon that we hear a lot of is feeling the noise. So you mentioned hearing it through. Now, obviously, we mentioned with temperature, you don't want to hold on to it. But with hearing it or feeling the noise,
Yes.
you can do it the same way. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So if you're going to use this method, we recommend using it on no load just for safety reasons. You can take a screwdriver and kind of put it up to your ear, the handle side, and put the tip on the gearbox. You'll be able to. It'll amplify almost like a doctor's stethoscope.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen that trick done. Again, that's a safety deal.
Yes.
If you can't do it safely, don't do it. I mean, a lot of this equipment is usually pretty well guarded. So if you have to remove a guard to do some of that, you want to think about that. But it is a commonly used tool from what I see.
Yes, it's quite interesting. And if you're concerned about noise, something you can measure is vibration, and that's probably your best metric to check.
Okay. So noise, like I said, it's subjective. What's noisy to me might not be noisy to you. And a lot of it depends on the type of gearbox too. So you have the Cyclo versus a Paramax unit like this, or a small worm box, or whatever the case may be. The sounds are going to be different at a good unit.
Yes.
So you have to understand what gearbox you're working with.
And also your conditions you're in. If it's in a small room like we are today, it's going to sound louder than if it's outside, and the sound can dissipate a little bit. Also, if you're running at a higher RPM, it's going to be higher pitched and expect a different noise.
Or even if the loading is different.
Correct.
So day to day, the applications, they do the same amount of work each day, but some days could be worse than others. So that noise is going to transmit there too. So going back to the trending, like we talked about with temperature, noise, quantify it the best you can with whatever test you're using for noise, but trend it over time. That one day, it just isn't enough.
Correct.
Right. So, okay. So the next one is leaking.
Oh.
So leaking, why do gearboxes leak? What's going on to make things leak?
So we've got three common causes that we see very, very frequently, and they're all a bit different, but they can cause the same leaks.
Okay.
So the number one thing, and I'm going to come back to this example again, and these three are not in specific order. They're just, A, B, C. So this one has, some external plumbing. You can see some of these components and plugs, they can get loose. Leaks can occur out of them. So that's an easy thing to check right away. As you can see, this plug itself is hand tight. Sometimes those things happen. The vibration will loosen these things up, and it's good to check them over time for leaks. The next thing is your breather setup. And this is, again, another external component that is fairly easy to check and should be done regularly. So I've got a couple breathers here. We've got descant breathers and a traditional breather. These are just kind of two that we see pretty commonly and thought we would elaborate on. So the descant breathers, you can see this is a brand new one. This is for moist environments, and it is also anti-dust. It's got these plugs. You'll know to switch this one if it turns to this color, yellow. If that's clogged, that's another thing you can check, pull it off, screw it off, check in there. Is it clogged or not?
Right.
And clogged breathers will create pressure within the gearbox. This pressure will force the lubrication out of the seals. And it will compromise the seals, requiring replacement. And then our traditional breather, it just twists off.
That's a long one. So while I was doing that, the breather is supposed to let air out,
Yes.
right? So if air can't get out, so when the gearbox warms up, it builds up pressure, and for pressure, that pressure needs to go somewhere. So that's what the breather's for. But with that being open, allows dirt or dust in. So different versions keep that from happening.
That's correct. And if it, like you said, if it's blocked, no air can get out. That air is going to create the pressure inside.
And then the leaks happen at the seals.
And you can see, inside it's a pretty small hole that can get clogged easily if there are contaminants within the gearbox, or if an excess of dust gets in there.
Right. Or even overfilling at that point.
That's
I mean, if you
correct.
overfill that and the breather is now saturated with oil, it's not breathing anymore either.
That's a great point. And if your gearbox is, you're changing arrangements and you're going from a horizontal to a vertical, you might not have the correct breather arrangement, and leaks can come out of your air vents.
Of the breather that way too.
Right. And that's a good transition point, I think, Adam, to go to our third reason for leaks, which is overfilling the gearbox.
Oh yeah, right.
We've got a picture here that shows kind of the proper level of a horizontally mounted gearbox. As you can see, this is kind of a basic diagram that shows where the oil level should be on a horizontally mounted unit. If you overfill that, it will create, again, pressure on these seals. Right here and here, it'll be able to escape out, or even at the low speed end. This can happen for a number of reasons, whether the quantity of oil put in the gearbox is unknown, or you can't read the sight gauge properly, but that will create leaks as well. So if you're worried about not having enough lubrication, overfilling is probably not your best option either.
So just to get an idea why we need a certain oil level, just kind of show why you're going to that certain level.
Sure. So the level is right around here. As you can see, we want to get each of these bearings lubricated properly so that they're protected and that their life is maintained, as well as all of the gear meshes. So as this first pinion is a bit smaller, we have a slinger here. This will splash lubricate the other components as well and create that thin film on each of these teeth to protect them.
Right, and that goes back to one of our previous webinars talking about input speed selections. If your input speed is too low, that slinger can't do what it has to do.
That's
because
correct.
it won't sling up to those other components.
That's correct. And if that happens, that's the case. That's why it's important to select the right gearbox so you have the right type of lubrication.
Right.
And you can see on the back here, there is a sight gauge. This is just kind of a up and down gauge, and there's two lines that have worn off. That means this probably should be replaced so that you have the proper amount of lubrication in this gearbox. This is something that can be replaced, just like a breather, and should be done so that you are properly lubricating your units.
Oil level, right.
Correct.
And same thing with the drain valve on the end there.
Correct. Yes, you can see this one's a bit corroded, the handle's bent a bit, and it would probably be a best practice to switch this.
Right. Okay. So yeah, leaking, that's probably the question we get all the time. But yeah, that covers most of the reasons why. So, so talking about lubrication in general, what is the importance of the proper lube? So we've talked previously about oil levels and things. Why do we make sure it's the correct lube?
That's a great question. Some gearboxes take different types of lubrication better than others. For instance, some prefer mineral oil and some prefer synthetics. That's just an easy example. And that can be found again in this operation and maintenance manual from the manufacturer, whoever it may be. They should have a approved list, and it's wise to follow that list as well.
Okay.
And knowing your operating conditions should help dictate the lubrication you choose. If you're in a warmer environment, a higher viscosity is probably a good choice. Again, and vice versa. If you're in a lower temperature, a lower viscosity. is
Because
a good
the
choice.
temperature affects the thickness of the oil.
Correct.
And it, again, we mentioned splash lube,
Yes.
it won't flow as well.
If you put a high viscosity lubricant inside a gearbox in a very cold environment, you're not going to get the protection you need. And the
You're turning
lubrication.
molasses at that point.
Exactly. Great example. Great example.
So that's not going to work.
That's
Would you
correct.
say lubricate the wrong lube or wrong level, but we'll stick to wrong lube. Would you say that's the #1 cause that you guys see?
If we kind of lump lubrication together, yes, I would say so. We see a number of issues with choice as well as temperature, which is involved with choice as well, and not changing the lubrication as frequently as they should.
In some cases, not changing it at all.
That's correct, correct. And so like for a unit like this cycloidal gearing will last as long as that lubrication is good. So that's another reason why it's just so important to switch your oil on the recommended intervals. And there's that first one as well, doing it early, then switching it out. That's kind of a maximum too, those times. If you change your oil more frequently than those limits, that's always a good practice.
It doesn't hurt to change it more.
Not at all.
It gets to an expense there. Obviously, there's costs associated with changing oil, but
It is.
from a long life, you can't change it too much.
That's correct. And as long as you keep it clean, your gearbox will run pretty soundly.
Right, right. As far as intervals, we mentioned changing it when it's failing, when the oil not the reducer's failing, but the oil is starting to fail. But what about seasonally? So some people
Yeah.
do that, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And some people run their units at a warm temperature in the summer, and then in the winter, it snows and it gets colder. You might need to switch your viscosity then. And to do so, you just open up that drain plug we looked at, rinse it out, flush the whole unit, and then switch it into another approved lubricant at the new viscosity level.
Right. Now, we can go for hours on lubricant, and I know we don't have that kind of time today, but do you really need to flush it every time, or is it more just a good practice to do that?
I would say it is a good practice, and you should flush it if you are seeing metal particulate or anything in the bottom of your housing.
Okay.
When you drain that gearbox, there should be an inspection cover on the top, especially for these larger units. Look inside, grab a flashlight. If you're seeing metal or any type of loose material in the bottom, you're going to want to rinse that out. Then it'll also rinse kind of off your components as well.
We didn't put it there.
No, exactly. And it should be said that there's a startup kind of oil change. It's a much smaller interval. And
500 versus 2,000 hours for normal, but 500 is your
so that's
first.
kind of like your break-in. So when that happens, it is not uncommon to see some small shavings of metal in the bottom that first time. That's okay, and that will happen. That will be flushed out, and then it should run clean. If your next oil change, you see that metal particulate again, or
especially larger quantities.
correct.
Yeah.
That's when you might need to look at what's going on and
take a deeper dive.
exactly.
Okay. The next, so kind of going to lube and changes and stuff. We say, for example, we had a unit, it failed. We put in a spare, and then within weeks, the spare failed. So to us, in this example, to us, that spare was brand new. Well, why did it fail? So what did we do wrong with that spare? What should we do with spares?
That's a good question. And going back to, you mentioned asset management at the beginning. A spare is an asset and should be treated as such. And you still need to maintain, even if it's not in operation. And the first step you can do is, if you know it's going to be put into long-term storage, is to prep it for long-term storage.
So either you prep it or your manufacturer can prep it.
That's correct. And it can even be sent in if it's got taken out of operation, said this is now going to be our new spare. It can be sent back to the manufacturer and recoated with a thin film on the inside and saved for long-term storage.
Okay. So just things to consider when they're in storage. Normally they're not full of oil, right?
Correct.
And some other factors.
Some of the other things you should look at is the most important would be rotating your shaft. you're going to want to do this fairly
We
frequently.
probably show over here. Yeah.
That's a good idea. So you're going to want to take the input, and even just doing it by hand, there's going to be no load on this gearbox, and you're just going to want to turn it once, and that's all.
Just keep it moving, lubricate the bearings.
Exactly. If you get one full turn on low speed, that's always a good thing to do. And this will also, change your contacts for all the gears, and so that they're not stuck in one position for years.
Right. Speaking of being stuck, is there anything I need to consider when I'm putting one of these gearboxes on the shelf? So if I just throw it up on the
Yeah.
shelf, is it okay? Should I just leave it there, or?
That's a good point. You need to look at your conditions as well, just like putting them into operation. Think about your surroundings. Are you putting it in a cold environment? Are you putting it in a risky place? For example, you don't want to put it near high amounts of vibration. Besides train tracks or under a heavily used bridge, those might not be the best places. And that can lead to Brunelling on the bearings and then damage to the gearbox.
So Brunelling, you elaborate on that a little bit. So if you have a bearing, it's literally shaking, right?
It is. It's shaking. It's creating some indentations on those races and damage to the rollers. You'll see lines that are evenly spaced on those races, and it creates that uneven wear on the rollers.
So it kind of looks like a pothole on an interstate. So if that roller bearing, every time you start it up, you'll hear it every single time. Because just from sitting there,
yes,
it was vibrating and causing damage. Yeah.
Correct. It's creating that wear, and it's an unnecessary risk to take.
Right. So you say coating it with fluid for long-term storage. What does that do? What does that do internally? So it's not a full oil.
No, it's a special coating that or your manufacturer will spray on the entirety of the interior that protects it from corrosion and moisture, and keeps it safe for a long time.
And no breather at that point.
Correct. No
Breather
breather.
sealed.
Since there's no splashing and gas is being created, it does not need to basically burp itself.
Right. When it's on the shelf.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
But as soon as you put it into service, that's where you start going into what we talked about in previous sessions. Put your breather in, make sure it's mounted level.
Yes.
And that sort of thing.
And you guys covered installation already, and
Right.
that's something to go back to whenever you're putting in a spare. Those same practices should be followed.
Right. Check that the unit's in good shape, no obvious leaks.
Yes.
Most spares do get covered in dust. So like we talked about earlier, keeping the fans clear, dust out, and mounting it correctly per the manufacturer is always
That's correct.
for a
And
spare.
another thing to consider when you're putting in the spares is if you do have that coating we speak of on the inside, is to flush that out. That you're going to want to rid your interior of the gearbox of that fluid and replace it with a proper lubrication. Like
Right,
we
because
already
it's
talked
that coating is not for lubrication per se. It's not to help the bearings. It's not for the gears. It's mainly so the material doesn't rust,
about.
essentially.
Correct.
It's just there. So you want to flush that out. So that kind of goes to our flushing again. You must want to flush it before you put it in, and then fill it to your appropriate level.
Correct.
Right. So, okay, we got one last little topic here. This could be a very long topic in and of itself, but we'll kind of keep it short here. But so I had a failure. What do I do? How do I prevent that from happening again? What are the first couple steps in keeping that from happening again?
Oh, that's a very valid point and something that could be elaborated on for days.
Yeah.
And to summarize it pretty quickly and kind of top level, the first thing to do would be determine why did this fail? That way you can mitigate whatever happened previously and set up your next unit for success.
Right.
After that, you want to look at possible selection and saying, do we have the right gearbox? If not, you might need to change it or upgrade it.
So in previous sessions, we've talked about service factor. So if your
Yes.
service factor is too light, if you're seeing that type of bearing failure, or I believe we have an example of bearing failure there, Noah. If you're seeing this type of damage, I mean, that can you explain a little bit there? Well, what would cause that? I mean,
Yeah, that's a good question. And this type of failure goes back to the point we touched on a little earlier, which is lubrication. And this pitting and spalling, it didn't get the proper lubrication, and as a result, it was too much rough contact and it wore down.
It was
the
basically metal to
controllers.
metal.
Yes,
There
it
was no oil in between there.
Correct. It did.
So
When the oil is in there, it'll create a thin layer on the rollers and on the gear teeth. And if it's not there, it's like you said, metal on metal contact. It'll just grind
that's
it all
never good.
down.
At the speeds these components are going, especially on the high speed side, that's not going to last very long.
Not at all.
So poor maintenance would be the example there,
Yes.
if any maintenance. So when it comes to the oil and the cold temperatures, what I know we talked about making sure it's at the right temperature and heaters and such. How can you mess up with a heater? What would cause some issues there?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to our seasonal changes as well. If you're using a heater, it is a good idea to use, in colder temperatures if you want to keep your same lubricant.
Right.
But then in the
Yeah,
summer,
sometimes a heater can avoid you from using seasonal oil changes
That's
because you're going to
correct.
heat the oil before you start it up.
That's right.
But at the same time, it brings its own problems. It can.
Yeah, it definitely
if
can.
maintenance is poor.
In the summer, if the ambient temperature rises significantly and you have the heater on, the gearbox is running, that's a lot of heat in there. That can kind of create a burnt lubrication. I think we have another
that
picture
heater
of
shot
that
there,
as
yeah.
well. This is a heater where you can see the lubricant was baked on to those heating elements. This caused, as you'll see in the next photo, a serious varnish inside all of those components in the gearbox.
So that heater destroyed the oil,
Yes.
and then destroyed every other component inside.
Yeah, it definitely caused some damage, and it takes a long time to clean these types of things. Luckily, we were able to get in there and get to it quickly to prevent further damage from occurring.
Right.
So it's just another reason that you want to make sure your lubricant is running properly, to switch it when you need to, and make sure it's at the right temperature.
If you learn nothing else today, changing your oil is the
Yes.
best maintenance you could possibly get.
Correct. And then going back to the first point we talked about, the temperature, it would have been able to see that the temperature was too high, this lubricant's burning up, and that's going to cause some damage.
Right. So change your oil. That's
Yes.
that's the least we can ask. It definitely no matter what gearbox it is, it prolongs the life of it.
That's correct.
So I think that covers all our points for today. There's plenty more questions. And like I said, we can go hours on some of these topics. But we do have some questions here. We'll jump to those right now. Let's see here. So I'll just take this first one here. Do you just remove the standard breather and wash it with water and blow out, or how would you clean one of those standard breathers?
That's a good question. And that would also depend on how dirty it is or how clogged it is. You can replace it, and that's probably the easiest practice. You can see they're just threaded, unthreaded, and it's got a wrench fitting. Take it off, put a new one on.
Okay.
You can clean it out if there's not too much. You're going to want to keep the water out of the gearbox. So if you do, kind of rinse it down or something, you're going to want to make sure that's completely dry so that no water gets in or foreign contaminants get into
back
the
in.
lubrication.
Right. So definitely remove it before you wash it.
Correct. And
Okay.
you make sure you cover that hole back up as well.
Right, when breather's off, especially in dusty, it'll get in there quick.
That's right. That's right.
All righty. All right, we have one more, or we have a couple more. We'll go through them here. Most gearboxes either have a dipstick or an oil level gauge.
Yes.
Correct? Is that
Yeah.
the most common?
Yeah, that's fair to say. If you have an oil level gauge, you're going to want to follow that. It should have a small range as well. The common are the vertical oriented gauge or a bullseye type. The bullseye you want to line up with that dot in the middle.
Right. And speaking of that oil level, so we know some units do have grease in them also. So
That's
smaller
correct.
units, definitely not these larger ones here, but some of these smaller ones can be grease filled. Just real high level, what's the quickest way to tell if you have grease, and what should we do with grease units?
So if you are wondering if you have a grease unit or oil and you can't remember, fast check is, does it have a sight gauge? If it doesn't, it's grease.
More than likely grease.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's correct. And if you have a dipstick, when you're reading it, you're going to want to make sure that it's read while the unit is at rest.
So not running, not turning,
Correct.
sitting there.
The
Okay.
splashing will affect your reading, similar to on the car.
Okay. All righty. So, and with grease, there's no really maintenance for, they're largely considered maintenance free.
That's correct. And one thing you don't want to do is mix grease into your oil units as well.
Or vice versa, oil into a
Yes.
grease unit. If it's grease, leave it greased.
Yes. If it's grease, leave it greased. If it's oil, leave it oil.
Okay, all righty. So we were talking about flushing a gearbox. When you need to rinse it out, or flush it out, what would be the best way to flush it out with? Obviously, water I don't think would be the best because it'll always stay there and you'll never get it out. But would you flush it with, what would you flush it with between an oil change or?
There's a couple ways you can do it. You can pump it out and filter it through like a sock of sorts, and it'll catch all the contaminants, and you filter it back into the gearbox. It's probably a good practice to filter it through till that sock runs clean about twice.
Okay.
If you don't do that, you can fill it up or drain it all out, fill it up about a quarter of the ways with the oil.
With the same oil, or with a certain cleaning oil, or what would you fill it with?
I would typically say the same oil you're going to use.
Okay. Yeah, you don't want to.
You don't want to
You
mix
have it there.
sauces, so to
Right.
speak.
Okay. Okay. Hey, last one here. Some people just want to completely fill a spare gearbox with oil as long-term storage. Is that a good idea? Does that put any risks or anything? So not necessarily prep for storage like we talked about with the
Yeah.
coating, but just filled with oil. Is that okay? Does that hurt anything?
Yeah, it can. It certainly can. And you can cause leaks, compromise all your seals by doing that, overfilling the gearbox. That's one of the risks you run. It's also just, not a practice we typically recommend as well.
For storage, yeah.
Exactly.
From storage side, I could see if there's that much oil behind it, the seals aren't meant to hold that in from a pressure, from gravity. They're not designed for that.
Yeah, you're creating more pressure on those, rubber, silicone elements, and that's
Right.
going to.
And obviously, sitting on oil there, there's a cost factor there too. That's a lot of oil.
Exactly.
Some of these units are a couple 100 gallons in some cases, much bigger than this one, but
That's quite true.
but definitely out there. So let's see, what other questions do we have here? Okay, here's one here. Is flushing the unit just a matter of taking the oil plug off till it's empty, or is it a little bit more than that?
It is. So when you just take the oil plug off or open the drain valve, you're going to take out what's in there, but not necessarily everything. It might be a little higher than your lowest point, and there might also be some solids left in the bottom of your housing.
Right.
When you drain it out, that's a great first step, but you're also going to want to look inside your inspection cover, see what's in there and what it looks like.
Actually, we can show that here real fast if we can cut to this.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We can see where some of that stuff would or could get stuck.
So this one you can see is drained out, and if you look inside, there are a few pieces in there and some metal particulate. You're going to want to fill it up a bit, rinse it out, or drain it out until that's all gone.
Right.
So
you can see why you would want to fill it and not just drain it once.
Exactly. And if you don't do that and you just fill it back up with oil, this will get in your lubrication and be splashed around all of these components.
So you could be hurting yourself.
That's correct.
At that point. All righty. I think we had one more. Let's see. I'm looking at everybody here. Don't see any others coming in, so I think we're good for right now. Feel free to hang around afterwards, but I think thank you very much, Will. I think we covered a lot of good topics today. So thank you very much, but that's all we had for today. If there's any questions, we'll hang around for a little while and cover those. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll definitely see you on the next one.